got the Washington response to this in the prior panel, and now I believe we're getting the state and local response, the people on the ground where this is happening, you know, where the threat really is. And it's interesting how different those points of view are. And many times it is different between Washington and the rest of the United States. When Secretary Napolitano, though, stated that border security is better now than it's ever been, and the President agreed with her just recently in El Paso, I want to go one by one and ask whether you agree with that statement or not. Mr. McCaul.
I didn't hear the statement, but I will say this, that we're concerned that there is an increasing threat. The border is not secure more than it ever was. There has been some successes. We'd love to see all the federal resources, but the bottom line is it's not secure, and until it is, we're not going to be happy.
Mr. Horn?
I disagree with the statement. I think if she would meet with some ranchers on the border, as I have, she would get an earful as to the extent to which things are much worse than they were. She has some statistics that show some improvement, but if I could give an analogy, if we were to reduce her salary to $5,000 a year, and then the next, this is just an analogy, it's not a proposal, but then the next year double it to $10,000, that would be a 100% increase, but it would still be inadequate in absolute terms. And I think the same thing applies here. Even if there has been some improvement in numbers, the absolute situation is totally unacceptable. I mentioned 400,000 people a year crossing in the Tucson region alone. Even if that were a decrease from the prior year in absolute terms, it is utterly unacceptable. And things are going to be possibly getting much worse because the support for President Calderon politically for his heroic actions is waning. So things could get much worse. And so to promote complacency at this time, I think is very dangerous and scary.
And I agree with the President Calderon comment. I think the window's shutting. His time is coming to a close, and he is a really effective partner that we need to be helping more in a post-Merida operation. Sheriff, the same question.
Mr. Chairman, with all due respect to Secretary Napolitano, she has been somewhat responsive to our needs. She has, we communicate often through somebody in her office, but there has not been too much change in the border, sir. It's not more secure than it's ever been. We still have problems, and I really have not seen any change, since, like my statement read, since September 11, 2001. It's getting more violent. The smugglers are getting more brazen. They're giving orders to confront us. So it's not as if it's more secure. Things, for example, of not taking, sometimes our cases regarding illegal immigrants, that brings your totals down. But we cannot just release them back into our community a lot of times because they're criminals. Some of them are criminals.
And I wanted to follow up on a point you made, the Border Area Security Initiative grants. We have UASC grants, which are urban area, but we don't have a border area grant funding. Would that be helpful to the border sheriffs?
Most certainly would, Mr. Chairman. As I've discussed before, we're doing sometimes, unfortunately, the job of the federal government. We have to be the ones we're the first responders. We're the ones that have to respond to what happens on Falcon Lake and everywhere else. The federal government doesn't respond. So yes, we do need the funding. With all due respect also, sir, that there's been a lot of federal agencies, specifically, like, for example, Border Patrol. And I'm not speaking bad, but they now have 22,500 agents. How many of those agents are really going to the border, and how many are going to task force? How many are going to do programs in schools? How many are going to do programs at shopping malls? In other words, if you give me 10 deputy sheriffs, I'm going to have 10 deputy sheriffs on the border if that's what they're going to do, not doing other stuff.
And Chief Rodriguez, the question about is the border more secure now than it's ever been?
Mr. Chairman, we should not rely on 1, 2, or 3 variables to make that call. And I'm afraid that the basis for those statements are less Border Patrol apprehensions and less detections of drugs through this Border Patrol. They have interpreted that to mean we're bringing this under control. And that's just not reliable enough to make that statement, in my opinion. We have incursions every day. We have people that are afraid to go out on their property. They're afraid to go out on their property. That's un-American. So if we rely on a set of numbers to simply make one point of view or the other, that will create a false picture of all of this. And that's one of the problems that we're facing on a constant basis.
I couldn't agree with you more. I wanted to focus on the basis for this assumption. And and Mr. McCaul, you worked in the FBI for many years. It's based on the Uniform Crime Report. When I heard the description of what the violence that they are perpetrating, it's extortions, kidnappings, cartel on cartel violence. And yet those very crimes are not part of the measurement under the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. What is your opinion in terms of that not being an accurate assessment when we talk about spillover violence?
Well, UCR data was established of the process back in 1930. It's over the years, it's no longer applicable, and we're talking about index crimes. It doesn't reflect what's going on the ground in near real time. And for example, smuggling, trespassing, vandalism is one. The increase of organized criminal activity, corruption. And as you noted, the non-index crimes, kidnappings, extortions, and recruitment of our kids, child prostitution. Where is that a good thing? You know, if you can't reflect all of those factors, if you can't reflect the manifestation of violence that is not just at the border, but ends up in our cities, reflected by the Texas Syndicate, Mexican Mafia, Hermanos Pistoleros Latinos, and other gangs that are working directly for these cartels, then you have a false understanding of what that threat is. And you're kidding yourself, because you're not going to secure the border through definitions.
I think that's an excellent answer. And I don't think we're getting an accurate picture by this report that the administration is relying upon. In fact, you did quote a statistic about El Paso, which is always touted as the safest city in the United States, but an increase of 1,200% in the murder rate this year.
Yes, sir, as reported by El Paso Police Department. And that's the problem when you start using Uniform Crime Report statistics that are dated to try to reflect what's actually going on. Another thing is that the activities that we've talked about, what you heard the chief talk about, aren't happening in his cities, because we take a very proactive law enforcement presence, and we're not going to allow cartels and gangs to move up and down into our cities. But where the smuggling activity is occurring is between the ports of entry.
Right.
And the latest look at the Uniform Crime Reports, and I think that the Secretary will find, is that if you segregate what the sheriffs are having to deal with, there's an increase in everything except stolen vehicles.
Well, I'd like to work with your office and all offices along the border and DOJ to get a more accurate assessment for what is the level of violence, because I don't think we're getting the right accurate picture. Special interest aliens, I know that number went up 37%. That's a pretty frightening number when you're talking about people coming from countries of interest that could have terrorist ties as well. And I think, you know, even though the numbers of apprehensions have gone down, that number seems to be going up, and that's a disturbing trend.
Well, and Texas has 74% of those special interest aliens across Texas that are apprehended. And you know, there's been years talk about, well, name one case, and obviously the San Antonio federal case of the Somalian is a significant concern, and underscores that this is not make-believe, that you can't secure your borders from foreign nationals, penetrating them undetected and uninterdicted. It constitutes a threat. We always have to be mindful of that.
I know that's a concern you and I have had starting with 9/11. One last question, and I'll yield to the ranking member. Mr. Horn, you started out unsolicited by saying you support the designation of a foreign terrorist organization for the drug cartels. You're obviously a lawyer by training, attorney general for a border state. Can you explain why you support that?
Well, among other things, it makes it an enhanced crime to supply aid to those organizations, and that's obviously would be a very powerful tool in fighting them.
Yeah, and my view is we ought to call them what they are. Their tactics are certainly like terrorists.